Have you ever found yourself just, caught in that daily flood of headlines? You see these huge announcements, monumental trade deals one day,
Mm-hmm.
and then the very next day, you read another article and it seems to completely contradict the first one.
Yeah, it happens all the time. It's incredibly confusing.
Exactly. It leaves you wondering, what's really going on? Like, how do you actually cut through all the political buzzwords and tell a real substantive agreement from, well, from what might just be a bit of political theater?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Well, today, that's exactly the puzzle we're tackling. We're taking a deep dive. Our mission is to crack the code on these recent global trade dynamics. And we're going to do that by specifically contrasting the, let's call it headline hype around recent U.S. trade deals with the hard agreements, like the one we saw with the UK-India Free Trade Agreement.
It's a really stark contrast when you put them side by side.
Totally. And the goal here is to give you a shortcut, really, to being truly well-informed on what these deals actually mean for global commerce and, crucially, what they mean for you.
Right.
We've pulled together quite a stack of sources for this deep dive, and recent articles, analyses from top financial news outlets, some in-depth reports from economic think tanks, and, of course, the official government statements themselves.
Yeah, it's a good mix. Gives you that sort of 360-degree view looking at intentions versus, well, the reality on the ground.
Exactly. So as we unpack all this, maybe keep one central question in mind. It's something like, when it comes to international trade, what truly empowers nations and businesses? Is it just the big public announcements and the fanfare?
Or is it the concrete, legally binding agreements, the stuff that's actually written down and enforceable?
Right. And what does that distinction really mean for our global economic future? Let's get started.
Yeah, let's dive in. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how clearly our sources illustrate these two very different philosophies playing out in global trade diplomacy right now. On one side, you've got this approach that, well, it often prioritizes public perception, maybe political leverage. And on the other, you see a model that's much more focused on detailed, measurable commitments, long-term economic strategy.
It really is a study in contrast.
It is, and it reveals a lot about the current state of international relations.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the U.S. approach first. We're talking about President Donald Trump's America First strategy, specifically in his second administration, looking at the context around, say, July 2025.
Right. The stated objectives are pretty clear, coming from the administration.
Yeah, they're very clear. Revitalizing domestic manufacturing, narrowing trade deficits, that's a big one for them, and securing national interests. And the method is often through, well, pretty aggressive protectionist policies.
It's definitely an assertive stance. The aim seems to be reshaping global trade in a way that, from their perspective, directly benefits American workers and industries.
And this approach, it was really epitomized by a pretty significant announcement earlier this year, wasn't it? Back in April 2025.
Oh, yeah. That was the introduction of what they dramatically called the Liberation Day tariffs. Quite a name.
It is quite a name.
And this involved a flat 10% tariff on all imports into the U.S., just blanket across the board.
Wow.
But it didn't stop there. These were then quickly escalated with country-specific reciprocal tariffs. So, for instance, our sources noted a 50% tariff slapped on Brazilian goods, 30% on imports from both the EU and Mexico.
Okay.
And initially, an unprecedented 145% tariff on Chinese exports. That was later reduced to 30%, but still a massive number.
That's huge.
Yeah. This aggressive stance was really meant to signal a new era, a new way of doing trade policy, where unilateral action was, well, a primary tool in the toolbox.
And following that, we've seen a few really high-profile deals pop up, generating a ton of headlines. Let's take the U.S.-EU trade deal, announced July 27th, 2025.
Right.
This was presented as this landmark agreement, the one that narrowly averted a transatlantic trade war. It came just days before a threatened 30% tariff hike on EU goods was supposed to kick in. The pressure was definitely on.
Absolutely. The sources really paint a picture of intense last-minute negotiations. The headline definitely suggested a major breakthrough.
So what were the terms? What did they actually agree on?
Okay, so the key terms, as reported. The U.S. agreed to apply a 15% baseline tariff on most EU goods. Now, this was presented as a reduction from that threatened 30% that was looming, set for August 1st.
Okay, so down from the threat, but still 15%.
Exactly. In return, the EU agreed to zero tariffs on U.S. goods. On the surface, that looks like a pretty significant concession from Europe, right?
Yeah, it does.
Specifically looking at cars, tariffs on EU automobiles coming into the U.S. were cut from 27.5% down to 15%. That's some relief for, say, German and French automakers.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but. A crucial detail, often kind of glossed over in the initial noise, is that a substantial 50% tariff on EU steel and aluminum remains in place.
50%,
Yeah.
still.
Still. Reflecting ongoing worries in Washington about strategic materials, industrial capacity, that sort of thing. And furthermore, specific strategic sectors, think aerospace, pharma, semiconductors, even spirits, they were explicitly excluded from this current tariff framework.
Okay. So carve-outs, leaving room for more arguments later, maybe.
Potentially. Separate future negotiations are definitely implied there.
And what about the EU's side of this bargain? The sources mention some truly staggering commitments.
Yeah, the numbers are huge. The EU pledged to purchase literally hundreds of billions worth of U.S. energy, specifically LNG, liquefied natural gas, and oil, over the next 5 years.
Oh.
This was framed as a way to boost U.S. energy exports and, reduce European reliance on other suppliers. Plus, Brussels committed to an additional hundreds of billions in FDI, that's foreign direct investment. Basically, European companies investing more in the U.S., building on existing investments in American infrastructure, tech, manufacturing.
And more purchases, too.
And they also agreed to increase purchases of U.S. military equipment and automobiles. These are, they're truly massive numbers if they fully materialize.
Okay, if being the operative word there, because that's where the critique comes in, right?
That's exactly where the critique from sources gets really sharp. They suggest there was, and I quote, little sign of a quid pro quo. Meaning, much of what Trump supposedly got in these deals, things like the Japanese investment we'll talk about, or these EU energy purchases, well, they might have happened anyway. Or they were sort of extracted under duress, under the threat of those high tariffs. One source even wryly commented that Trump might simply be sticking his name on money flows that were already in motion. The real point of contention is that while, yes, 15% is lower than a threatened 30%,
right,
it is still, as one analyst put it, vastly higher than the near-zero tariffs that existed before Trump's protectionist policies really kicked off.
So it's not a return to free trade at all?
Not even close. It was framed as a reduction, but it's a reduction from an artificially inflated threat level.
But the economic implications here,
Yeah.
They sound really significant. You mentioned tariffs are essentially a sales tax.
Exactly. Think about it this way. That 15% tariff on, say, imported European cheese or machinery, that cost isn't really absorbed by the European company for long. It gets passed directly to the importer and ultimately to you at the checkout counter. It just shrinks your purchasing power.
And who feels that the most?
Well, sources point out it disproportionately affects lower-income Americans. It potentially reduces their real income by about 1.5%. So while it's often touted as protecting American jobs, the immediate economic burden falls heaviest on those who can least afford it.
That's a really important point to understand.
It is. And beyond just the economics, there's a critical political implication here, especially for Europe. Commentators have observed that by appearing to concede without retaliating, even though arguably they were entitled to retaliate because the U.S. had kind of reneged on past agreements, the EU made itself, quote, look weak. And this, in the view of some analysts, could be a bad omen for its ability to deal with, well, real challenges, starting with the very complex situation of supporting Ukraine.
So perceived weakness in trade could spill over into geopolitics.
That's the concern. Perception matters. It's also worth noting, sources point out Trump seemed to back down on his controversial idea of treating European value-added taxes, VAT, as an unfair trade barrier, which, as the source flatly states, they aren't.
Right. Basic economics.
Basic economics. But as the source notes, facts sometimes don't matter as much as perception in these kinds of high-stakes negotiations.
Okay, moving beyond Europe, let's turn to Asia. Specifically, the U.S. negotiations with Japan. We saw a similar pattern there, right? High-profile announcements, the U.S. Japan deal announced July 22nd, 2025.
Yep, same playbook it seems. Hailed as historic, building on some 2019 agreements promising improved access for American cars and farm goods, again, sounded like a major win on paper.
And what were the key provisions there?
Okay, so according to the sources, Japan promised a huge sum, hundreds of billions in investment into U.S. industries. Specifically called out were semiconductors, energy, and manufacturing. a really significant financial commitment.
Okay.
In return, the U.S. supposedly got expanded market access for its agriculture, things like beef, soybeans, rice, and also for U.S. automobiles going into Japan. And there was a specific tariff reduction mentioned. The Japan-specific tariff was rolled back from 24% down to a 15% reciprocal tariff, aiming to ease some of those existing trade frictions.
Here comes the deeper analysis again, right? The economic contradiction.
Exactly. Sources offer a pretty sharp critique here. They argue that this deal, despite all the positive rhetoric, will actually increase the U.S. trade deficit, not reduce it.
How does that work? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it's basic accounting, really. It comes down to the balance of payments. More foreign investment coming into the U.S., that's a capital inflow, necessarily leads to a larger trade deficit. You have to balance the books. Money coming in one way has to be balanced by goods or services going out, or vice versa.
So, pushing for more foreign investment while also claiming to reduce the trade deficit.
Shows, according to these analysts, a fundamental lack of understanding of how these economic forces actually interact. It's like trying to fulfill a bucket from the bottom while pouring water in the top and expecting it to get emptier. It just doesn't work that way.
And what are the deeper implications of that misunderstanding?
Well, they're quite concerning, potentially. The deal seems to, perhaps inadvertently, tilt the playing field against U.S. manufacturing.
How so?
Consider this example highlighted in the source. The deal places lower tariffs on cars made in Europe, which often have very little U.S. content, than it does on cars made in Canada, which typically contain many American parts.
Huh. That seems backwards.
It does seem backwards. Add in those continuing punishing tariffs on steel and aluminum, key inputs for manufacturing, and the overall effect, according to sources, is that Trump's trade policy seems, if anything, to be tilting the playing field against U.S. manufacturing.
And what about inflation? If tariffs stay at 15%.
Right. While businesses might try to absorb those extra costs for a while, maybe squeeze their margins, the persistence of a 15% tariff on imports suggests that for consumers, inflation is coming. That initial hope businesses had that these tariffs might mostly go away. The source states that hope will soon fade. Eventually, those costs get passed on.
Okay, so Europe, Japan. Now let's look at the U.S.-India Bilateral Trade Agreement, the BTA. This has been talked about a lot, promoted as this game-changing framework. The goal is huge, boosting bilateral trade from around $191 billion up to $500 billion by 2030.
Ambitious, definitely.
And Indian officials, like Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, were praising fast progress in negotiations back in July 2025. But here's the crucial detail.
The crucial detail is, drumroll, no formal agreement has been published.
There it is again.
There it is again. Despite all the positive pronouncements, the concrete, legally binding text just isn't there. This really highlights that recurring theme, deals existing more in headlines than in actual legal documents.
And are the goals aligned at least?
Not entirely. Both sides continue to push pretty divergent priorities, which obviously complicates reaching any swift resolution. The U.S. is largely focused on getting deeper market access for its agriculture, particularly sensitive items like dairy and soybeans, and also for electric vehicles.
And India, what do they want?
India, understandably, wants relief from those existing Trump-era tariffs, which are currently hitting many Indian exports at around 26%, and they want expanded access for their key sectors like textiles, gems, and pharmaceuticals into the U.S. market. Until these core disagreements are genuinely bridged in a written, verifiable agreement.
It's mostly just talk.
It remains largely aspirational, yeah.
So if we synthesize this whole U.S. approach across these different negotiations, Europe, Japan, India,
Yeah.
there seems to be a common thread, a kind of formula.
There really does. It's a pattern of 1, headline-grabbing announcements, 2, often followed by conflicting press releases or interpretations from each side, and 3, vague investment goals, all happening without finalized, signed agreements. And this approach, as our sources consistently indicate, appears driven less by careful economic policy and much more by political positioning.
Right. Whether the goal is countering China or appearing to revive industrial jobs or just burnishing President Trump's economic credentials, the optics seem key.
Optics seem paramount, but the risk is, in the absence of enforceable, detailed agreements, the uncertainty multiplies. Businesses get wary, right? Investors grow reluctant to commit serious capital, and the overall credibility of these trade declarations gets questioned again and again.
It creates that economic uncertainty you mentioned.
Exactly. Profound economic uncertainty that acts as a serious drag on markets, on investment, on growth. So the critical takeaway from the U.S. approach, as illustrated by our sources, it's often a strategy focused heavily on managing public perception, leveraging threats, maybe getting some concessions under
Well,
duress.
the actual economic shifts.
They seem minimal, often overshadowed by the negative impacts, like the hit to consumers from tariffs that don't really go away. It's a lot of sound and fury, perhaps signifying less than meets the eye in terms of concrete, long-term economic benefit.
Okay, now let's completely shift gears. Let's pivot and look at a dramatically different model. The UK-India Free Trade Agreement, the FTA.
Right. This agreement really stands in stark contrast to the U.S. approach we've just been discussing. It's presented by sources consistently as a more substantive model.
Grounded in measurable commitments, they say.
Precisely. Grounded in measurable commitments. It's offered as an alternative blueprint for how trade agreements can be structured, moving beyond just the rhetoric.
So a structured, detailed pact.
Very much so. It's an agreement that, despite having a few imperfections, which we'll get to, it moves beyond posturing to actual deliverables. It's an example of trade diplomacy aiming for clarity, for concrete outcomes, giving businesses and consumers genuine certainty, or at least more certainty.
And the timeline itself underscores that seriousness, doesn't it? This wasn't rushed.
Not at all. This FTA was finalized on May 6th, 2025. But that was after an impressive 15 rounds of negotiations that had been ongoing since January 2022, over 3 years of talks.
Wow, 15 rounds.
Yeah. And it was officially signed on July 24th, 2025, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to London. Both leaders hailed it, naturally, as a historic milestone and a huge economic win for both countries.
Okay, so let's get into the details. What are the key features that make it so substantive? Let's start with tariffs.
Right. The tariff reductions are specific and quantified. For Indian exports coming into the UK, sources highlight that a remarkable 99% of Indian exports will eventually be granted duty-free access.
29%, that's huge.
It's huge. And it covers crucial sectors for India: textiles, leather, footwear, marine products, various food items. This isn't some vague promise. It's a specific, quantifiable commitment laid out in the text.
And what's the expected impact of that?
Well, the expectation is a boost to Indian exports by around 20% within just 3 years. Think about the impact on coastal states like Kerala and Andhra Pradesh, where shrimp and tuna exporters, for example, previously faced tariffs somewhere between 4.2% and 8.5%. Those burdens are now largely lifted or scheduled to be lifted.
Okay, that's India exporting to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
What about the other way around? UK exports going to India? Because that's often where the big barriers are.
Absolutely. And this is where the agreement gets really interesting, perhaps setting a template. Remember those famous 150% tariffs on UK whiskey and gin going into India?
Yeah, astronomical. How could anyone compete?
Exactly. Well, those tariffs will be cut to 75% immediately, and then they'll be phased down further to 40% by 2035. Still high, maybe, but a massive reduction.
That's a game changer for that industry.
Totally. That alone is projected to boost UK spirits exports by about £1 billion over 5 years and create an estimated 1,200 jobs. That's specific, measurable impact you can point to.
What about cars? Always a big one.
Yep. Automotive tariffs, which were often over 100% in India, will fall to 10%, but importantly under a managed quota system. So not unlimited access, but a significant opening. And tariffs on UK lamb, previously 33%, are completely eliminated.
So significant market openings, even if some are managed. These aren't just symbolic.
Not at all. They represent real shifts in market access.
What about beyond goods?
Yeah.
Services and mobility. That's increasingly important in modern trade.
Hugely important. And the agreement dives deep here, too. It includes provisions for smoother business mobility and expedited visas for Indian professionals coming to the UK for short-term assignments. It even mentions specific categories like yoga instructors, chefs, and IT specialists.
Interesting.
And crucially, this is done without changing the broader UK immigration policy. It shows a very targeted approach just to facilitate trade-related movement.
Okay, and qualifications.
Yes, there's mutual recognition of professional qualifications in key fields like IT and finance. That reduces barriers for skilled workers moving between the countries. And a really significant component is the Double Contribution Convention Agreement.
What's that? Sounds technical.
It's basically a social security pact. It means Indian professionals working temporarily in the UK, or vice versa, don't have to pay social security contributions into both countries' systems simultaneously for up to 3 years. That eases a significant financial burden.
That makes sense. Practical stuff.
Very practical. And for UK service providers, they gain greater access to India's growing services market, though. It's worth noting, sensitive sectors like legal services are excluded for now. India's cap on foreign investment in its insurance sector is locked in at 74%, but there are provisions allowing it to rise to 100% in the future, signaling a clear path for more liberalization down the road.
And you mentioned something groundbreaking about government procurement.
Yes, this is a big one. UK firms will gain access to India's public procurement market. We're talking about approximately 40,000 government tenders issued annually, worth around 38 billion, across sectors like healthcare, transport, life sciences, and especially green infrastructure.
And this is unusual for India.
Highly unusual. Reports from leading think tanks specifically note this is the first time India has granted such extensive government procurement access to any Western nation. It's potentially a game changer for British businesses looking to bid on major Indian public sector projects.
Wow. Okay. What else stands out in the structure?
Well, the FTA establishes robust legal and institutional frameworks for monitoring how the deal is implemented and for resolving disputes if they arise. That includes a most favored nation clause for the UK, ensuring they get terms as good as any other partner India might sign a deal with later. This provides crucial stability and confidence for businesses.
And those progressive chapters, that sounds new for India.
It is. It includes new chapters specifically covering anti-corruption measures, labor standards, and gender equity. That's a first for any Indian FTA. It signals a broader commitment beyond just the pure economic metrics, incorporating modern governance and social considerations. Plus, there's a strong emphasis throughout the deal on collaboration in future-focused areas like fintech, digital trade, and clean energy.
So pulling it all together, what are the projected benefits? What do these concrete commitments actually translate into for the UK and India?
Okay, for the UK, the big win is access to India's high-growth market. We're talking about a country projected to be the world's third largest economy by 2028, with maybe 60 million middle-class consumers by 2030. That strategic procurement edge is massive, especially for UK firms in green tech or infrastructure. Overall, UK government modeling projects a GDP increase of up to 6.4 billion annually by 2040, and it clearly supports the UK's post-Brexit strategy of pivoting to non-EU markets.
And for India?
For India, that duty-free access for 99% of its exports means significant expansion potential, especially in labor-intensive sectors like textiles and marine products, which is crucial for job creation. The professional mobility provisions are a huge gain for India's large pool of IT and skilled workers. The agreement also reinforces the strategic partnership between the two nations, and Indian consumers should benefit from lower tariffs on imports like Scotch whiskey, giving them more choice and potentially better prices.
Now, you mentioned imperfections. Even a detailed deal like this isn't perfect. What are some of the caveats or pending issues?
Right. It's important to connect this to the bigger picture. No deal is ever perfectly complete the moment it's signed. Sources point out the legal text is still undergoing final scrubbing and finalization, which is pretty standard for complex agreements like this.
Sorry?
Key issues, like the precise details of certain visa categories and India's quite strong demand for exemption from the UK's upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism, or carbon tax, those remain unresolved. They're subject to ongoing negotiation in specific committees set up by the FTA.
So, still some work to do.
Still some work to do. There are also reports that India had to withdraw some earlier demands during the tough negotiation process, and the UK's standard 10% baseline tariff on certain goods still applies to India in some cases. Plus, sensitive UK agricultural sectors, think sugar, milled rice, pork, poultry, eggs, they're explicitly excluded from liberalization to protect domestic producers.
So substantive, yes, but not a complete free-for-all. There are still protections.
Exactly. It's a managed liberalization, balancing market opening with domestic sensitivities.
But even with those nuances, the projection is that bilateral trade could hit $100 billion annually by 2040. That's a massive increase from current levels. How is that projection justified?
It's ambitious, but the justification rests on a convergence of factors outlined in the sources. First, obviously, the major tariff cuts across 99% of Indian exports, and key UK categories like spirits and autos will naturally drive substantial trade growth. That's the direct effect. Second, India's own economic trajectory is a huge driver. Its import demand is projected to rise by a staggering 144% by 2035, potentially reaching 1.4 trillion. That's just a massive, growing market hungry for imports.
Right.
Third, the UK's new entry into India's huge government tender market will generate substantial new trade flows, particularly in areas like green infrastructure where UK firms have expertise. And finally, the emphasis on joint innovation collaboration in emerging sectors like clean energy and biotech, combined with the naturally complementary economic profiles India's strong in labor-intensive goods, the UK strong in premium goods and services, creates almost ideal conditions for sustained trade expansion over the long term.
It really sounds like, as you said, textbook economics made policy.
In many ways, yes. It tries to leverage comparative advantage in a structured way.
The contrast is just so striking. So let's bring it back. Why does this difference between the headline hype of the U.S. approach and the hard agreements of the UK-India model really matter?
Yeah.
What are the real-world consequences of deals built more on promises than on concrete, legally binding pacts?
Well, the primary impact, the one that echoes through everything else, is profound economic uncertainty. And that acts as this formidable drag on markets, on business decisions, when you don't have signed agreements, when you don't have clear legal texts.
Businesses just wait and see.
They hesitate. They hesitate to invest. They hesitate to commit capital. Our sources highlighted that tangible example. Jaguar Land Rover, JLR, actually pausing its U.S. shipments precisely because of unpredictable tariffs. They couldn't plan.
Right.
And that hesitation, multiplied across industries, leads to faltering supply chains, companies potentially losing market share because they can't commit, and stagnating trade volumes, all because there's no reliable framework for long-term planning.
And it's not just the direct business impact, is it? You mentioned diplomatic strain earlier.
Absolutely. It also creates significant diplomatic strain and fuels public cynicism. Think about it. When each country's leadership spins the deal for their domestic audience, maybe emphasizing different aspects or making slightly different promises.
Expectations get inflated.
Exactly. Expectations rise dramatically, only to collapse when the actual terms, which are often vague or unpublished, don't align with the hype. Imagine being a U.S. farmer hearing. You've got great new market access in Japan, but then it never really materializes in practice. Or an Indian exporter expecting tariff relief that doesn't actually come through as promised. That gap between promise and reality. It intensifies public cynicism and can really strain diplomatic relations over time.
And we saw immediate market reactions to some of these U.S. policies, right?
Oh, definitely. The immediate market impacts from this kind of policy volatility were clear. Following those Liberation Day tariffs announced in April 2025, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by thousands of points in just 1 week. The S&P 500 dropped significantly. Sources said it was its worst performance since 2020. The tech-heavy NASDAQ shed over 22% between February and July 2025. That's serious market turmoil.
And beyond the stock market, for everyday people.
Consumer confidence takes a big hit. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, a key indicator, hit a 28-month low back in March 2025, reflecting that uncertainty. And economists forecast that inflation could rise by almost a full percentage point if all the threatened tariffs were fully enacted, because, again, those tariffs largely function as a sales tax.
Passed straight to the consumer, affecting real income, especially for lower-income households.
Precisely. And then there's business investment paralysis. Companies just defer crucial capital expenditures, buying new machinery, building new plants, because the tariff environment is so unpredictable. Why invest heavily if you don't know what your input costs or market access will look like next year?
And the supply chain chaos sounds intense, too.
It really does. Retaliatory tariffs caused U.S. agricultural exporters to lose key contracts, especially in Asia. There were reports from the Port of Oakland warning about regional job losses as refrigerated exports declined. And companies trying to adapt, maybe by rerouting goods through third countries like Vietnam, they suddenly face the threat of new, hefty 40% circumvention tariffs.
It sounds like trying to navigate this is like playing high-stakes economic whack-a-mole for businesses.
That's a pretty good analogy. This constant shifting, this unpredictable imposition of tariffs, it just erodes global trust in the trading system and makes long-term international business incredibly difficult, if not impossible for some.
Okay, so that's the downside of uncertainty. Now, flip it again. What's the value proposition of the concrete agreement model, like the UK-India FTA?
In stark contrast, the UK-India FTA, even with its acknowledged imperfections and the issues still being worked out, delivers one crucial thing: greater certainty.
There's certainty.
That's its most significant benefit. It allows those Indian agricultural exporters we talked about to plan for real tariff relief because they know exactly what duties their shrimp and tuna will face when they arrive in the UK. Similarly, British service providers, whether they're in education or fintech, now have new, concrete reasons to expand into India because the terms of engagement, the market access, it's clearly laid out in the agreement.
It allows for actual business planning.
Yes. And it honors that fundamental logic of comparative advantage we talked about. India provides labor-intensive products like spices, textiles, seafood. The UK offers premium consumer goods like Risky and advanced services like finance or consulting. This is, as one source put it, textbook economics made policy. It's structured.
And that structure builds trust.
Absolutely. The deal's specificity, its targeted sectoral approach, its inherent transparency because the text is available, that's what builds trust and enables tangible ground-level growth and investment rather than leaving businesses constantly guessing and hedging their bets.
Okay, so given the success and the level of detail in the UK-India FTA, the big question is, can it serve as a template, specifically for a future U.S.-India trade agreement? That relationship is strategically vital, and there's that shared goal of reaching $500 billion in bilateral trade by 2030, a huge jump from $191 billion in 2023.
It's a really compelling question, and on the surface, there are definitely similarities that suggest it could be a potential template. Both the U.S. and the U.K. fundamentally seek broader access to India's massive and rapidly growing market. And India, in turn, desires better access to the huge U.S. market for its key exports, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and especially its professional services workforce.
Right, and those mobility provisions in the UK deal must look very attractive from India's perspective.
Absolutely. The UK deal's provisions on smoother business mobility, expedited visas for professionals, mutual recognition of qualifications, those are top priorities for India. They could definitely be mirrored in a U.S. deal, perhaps through reforms to the H-1B visa program or similar dedicated pathways, and maybe that Social Security Pact idea.
And then there's the broader strategic context pushing them together, right? Things like the Kiwa, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, ICAT.
Exactly. ICE, the U.S.-India initiative on critical and emerging technology initiatives like these, create powerful shared interests and incentives to deepen the economic relationship alongside the strategic one. It's not just about tariffs, it's about securing supply chains, collaborating on technology, and balancing power in the Indo-Pacific region. The trade piece fits into that larger puzzle.
And we've seen a sort of step-by-step approach elsewhere.
Yeah, the phased modular approach we saw in the U.S. Japan deal, even if that deal had flaws, suggests a model. It aligns with how India's current BTA discussions seem to be proceeding, with India reportedly offering targeted tariff reductions on things like pharmaceuticals and autos, similar to Japan's limited but strategic concessions.
And investment is a bargaining chip.
That's another parallel. Japan's huge $550 billion investment commitment was clearly linked to securing U.S. tariff relief. India could potentially leverage similar commitments, maybe greater energy and defense imports from the U.S., to help offset its substantial trade deficit with the U.S. and use that as a negotiating point to gain concessions elsewhere.
Okay, so there are definitely parallels, potential templates, but there must be significant differences, too, that make a straightforward copy-paste difficult for the U.S.-India dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. And this really gets to the heart of why U.S.-India trade talks have often stumbled. Why is it so much harder?
Okay, let's hear them.
First, and maybe most fundamentally, is the economic development gap. Unlike the highly developed economies of Japan and the UK, India is still very much a developing country. It has a deep structural reliance on agriculture and small-scale industries. Millions and millions of livelihoods depend on them.
Which makes certain U.S. demands very sensitive.
Extremely sensitive. U.S. demands for opening up Indian dairy and farm markets hit right at the heart of that sensitivity. It's not comparable to negotiating agricultural access with, say, Canada or Europe. Second is just the sheer scale and complexity. U.S.-India trade volume at $191 billion in 2023 is already over 4 times the India-UK trade volume.
Yeah.
And the U.S. economy, the GDP, just dwarfs the UK's. That naturally amplifies the complexity and the stakes of any negotiation. More sectors, more competing interests.
And the political backdrop. We touched on the U.S. approach.
Right. The political constraints are huge. The U.S. America First protectionism, with its high reciprocal tariffs, clashes directly with India's own historically high average tariff regime, which is around 17%. It's like two protectionist impulses colliding, making compromise really difficult.
What about tech and IP? Always tricky areas.
Very tricky. There are significant digital and intellectual property conflicts. The U.S. generally pushes hard for free cross-border data flows that directly conflicts with India's strong push for data localization rules and its sovereignty-based approach to data governance under things like the evolving Digital India Act
And pharma.
and pharmaceuticals. Intellectual property rights there are highly contentious. The U.S. pushes for stronger patent protections for its pharma companies, while India fiercely defends its WTO TRIPS flexibility, those rules allowing developing countries more leeway, particularly for producing affordable generic medicines, which is a huge industry for India.
There's also a difference in how they align globally, right?
Yeah.
Compared to Japan.
A fundamental difference in geopolitical alignment. Japan is a formal treaty ally of the U.S., operating under a mutual security alliance. Their trade relationship often aligns with broader strategic goals. India, by contrast, remains fiercely non-aligned. It meticulously balances its relationships with both the U.S. and China, and Russia too.
So it approaches deals differently.
Yeah, think of it this way. Japan might be like a long-term business partner with a joint venture agreement. India operates more like a highly skilled independent freelancer, making each deal a distinct negotiation, carefully weighing how it impacts all its global relationships, hesitant to join agreements perceived as too U.S.-centric.
And finally, those non-tariff barriers.
Yes, regulatory barriers are a major, persistent sticking point. India imposes high non-tariff barriers, things like complex quality certifications, import quotas, particularly on genetically modified GM agricultural goods, which are very common in U.S. exports but highly restricted in India. These aren't just about tariffs, they're about regulations, standards, and they're often very difficult to negotiate away.
Okay, so let's circle back to agriculture because it seems like such a key staking point. Is the U.S. agricultural policy really unreasonable in these talks, as some of the source critiques suggest?
Well, the sources we looked at state pretty clearly that this critique is not unfounded. It's identified as a key area of divergence, a major roadblock.
Why is the U.S. position often seen that way? Agriculture is a small part of the U.S. economy overall, right?
It is only about 1% of U.S. GDP, but its political influence is disproportionately strong. This is largely due to, one, substantial government subsidies. We're talking around $30 billion annually, which largely benefit major agribusiness corporations like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill. And two, powerful rural voting blocs and influential political lobbies like the American Farm Bureau exert significant pressure on policymakers to demand maximum market access abroad.
And on the other side, India's agricultural sensitivities are just on a completely different scale.
Completely different. Agriculture accounts for, estimates vary, but around 46% of India's labor force. That's roughly 150 million people, most of them small-scale farmers, many operating at subsistence levels.
So the impact of imports is potentially devastating.
A sudden, unrestricted influx of heavily subsidized U.S. products, dairy, soybeans, poultry, almonds, could severely impact the livelihoods of literally millions of Indian farmers. We saw the profound political risk of agricultural liberalization in India during those massive farm law protests in 2020 and 2021, which ultimately forced the Indian government to repeal the laws.
So it's not just economics, it's deeply social and political for India.
Absolutely. And this is where the UK model offered that pragmatic flexibility. They seem to prioritize value-added sectors like whiskey or financial services over pushing hard on agriculture. They accepted Indian quotas and phase-ins for sensitive products, allowing, for example, lamb and salmon imports, but under carefully designed, managed conditions. This contrasts pretty sharply with the often maximalist U.S. stance demanding broad, unrestricted market access for almost all its agricultural products.
It sounds like a fundamental difference in approach to sensitive sectors.
It really does.
So looking ahead then, given all these complexities, what is the path forward for U.S.-India trade? How do they navigate these challenges and maybe leverage the opportunities?
Well, the persistent challenges remain clear. Agriculture is number one, where India seems firm on protecting its farmers. Intellectual property, especially around pharmaceuticals, remains contentious. Immigration issues, particularly U.S. caps on temporary visas like the H-1B, are a major Indian grievance impacting professional mobility. Digital trade rules and data governance are increasingly complex. And you always have the backdrop of election cycles in both democracies, which can inevitably delay or derail trade talks due to shifting political
But
priorities.
there are opportunities too, right? That strategic alignment you mentioned.
Definitely. The strategic realignment through frameworks like the Quad and IC strengthens the mutual interest in deepening ties, including economic ones, to balance power in the Indo-Pacific. That provides a powerful tailwind.
And the UK deal showed potential in certain sectors.
Exactly. The success of the UK deal, particularly in areas like services and mobility, opens possibilities for U.S.-India cooperation in high-growth areas like fintech, AI, insurance, renewable energy, and India's vast infrastructure needs and growing manufacturing sector remain highly attractive to U.S. capital. Look at Micron's major investment in a semiconductor plant in Gujarat. That shows the potential. Plus, the UK precedent for things like a social security pact or specific mobility arrangements could potentially be replicated, building goodwill.
So if we were to sketch out a realistic roadmap, what would it look like? You mentioned realism over idealism.
That's the key, I think. A short-term, incremental approach for, say, 2025 to 2027 seems the most likely, most realistic path forward.
A mini deal.
Exactly. A focused mini deal covering less contentious sectors, maybe textiles, pharmaceuticals, where there's some alignment, clean energy technology. The U.S. could offer targeted tariff cuts on some Indian exports, expand tech cooperation, but crucially avoid those highly sensitive agricultural demands for now. And negotiations might realistically pause and resume around India's 2026 state elections, acknowledging the political realities. This approach is very much like that incremental U.S. Japan mini deal model.
Okay, that's the short term. What about the long term, maybe looking towards 2030?
For the long term, maybe 2027 to 2030, the success of the India-UK FTA could actually create pressure on the U.S. to pursue something broader, more comprehensive, especially if India manages to finalize similar deals with other major partners like the EU or Australia. That could motivate the U.S. to get more ambitious, leading potentially to a gradual convergence on services standards, technology cooperation, investment frameworks, maybe finding common ground through collaboration on things like climate-smart agriculture or supply chain resilience areas that can bridge some of the major gaps by moving beyond direct confrontational market access disputes towards areas of clear mutual benefit and innovation. But that's definitely a longer-term prospect.
And finally, based on everything we've discussed, what policy recommendations emerge from this deep dive? What could both nations do to maybe smooth the path forward?
Okay, for the U.S., the clear recommendation seems to be focus on your strengths in technology, professional mobility, and advanced services where alignment with India is stronger. Limit the agricultural demands, recognizing India's unique sensitivities, offering greater flexibility on H-1B visas, and seriously pursuing a social security pact, like the UK did, would build significant goodwill and address key Indian priorities.
And for India?
For India, the advice is generally to work on simplifying its non-tariff barriers, which are a constant complaint from foreign businesses, and provide greater clarity and predictability on its digital trade norms and data rules. While, of course, maintaining necessary protections for its sensitive sectors like agriculture, perhaps through carefully managed quotas or longer phase-in periods rather than outright bans.
And jointly.
Jointly, they could establish focused working groups for specific niche sectors where there's clear potential, maybe organic goods, semiconductors beyond just assembly, green hydrogen technology. Creating these smaller, more manageable channels for collaboration can build trust and deliver incremental wins over time, paving the way for bigger agreements later.
What a fascinating journey into the complexities of modern global trade. We've really unpacked that core contrast, haven't we, between the headline hype we see sometimes, particularly with the recent U.S. announcements, and the hard agreements exemplified by something like the UK-India Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, the difference is stark.
It really is. And it seems clear that while headlines grab attention, it's the clear, legally binding trade deals, even if they're imperfect and take ages to negotiate, that are truly crucial for global economic stability and building trust. Agreements built more on promises than concrete pacts seem to just breed uncertainty for businesses and consumers alike.
That uncertainty has real costs.
Absolutely. And understanding these distinctions truly matters for you listening right now. Whether you're a consumer feeling the pinch on prices, maybe a business owner trying to navigate these unpredictable supply chains, or simply someone curious about the intricate dynamics of global economics. These policies directly impact our daily lives, our job markets, and international relations in very tangible ways.
They really do filter down.
So as you consider these global trade patterns moving forward, here's a final thought to maybe mull over. In our increasingly interconnected world, are we heading towards a future where trade is genuinely driven by economic fundamentals and mutual benefit? Or will political grandstanding and strategic positioning continue to dictate the flow of global commerce? And perhaps even, what impact might your choices as a consumer, as an investor, as a citizen have on how this unfolding story plays out?